Hey, it's Jordan with Status Coup. Delighted to be joined by Mikey Inoue. He is a Oahu water protector down in Hawaii, and has been one of the leading activists on the front lines fighting to shut down the Red Hill fuel storage tanks, which unfortunately, with COVID and now war and many other things, has not really gotten a lot of attention in the mainstream media. But honestly, when you look at the Flint water crisis and other water catastrophes, is equally, if not more, of a crisis. What's going on in Hawaii? Obviously, our mainstream media didn't really care that much about the Midwest, and Flint doesn't really seem to care about our wonderful citizens in Hawaii. But Mikey, let's just bring it back for the audience who has no idea anything in this story. The Navy thought it would be a good idea, like a half a century ago, to store 20 like pill-shaped fuel tanks with jet fuel underneath a mountaintop right above the aquifer. Can you tell people who don't know this story what was stored under there? And essentially, it seems like the Navy stored it under there and just really didn't do any due diligence to make sure it wasn't leaking.
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for having me, Jordan. Got a great show going, and always appreciate it when, left outlets try to push this story because, like you said, the mainstream media has definitely not been on top of it. And it took a lot of internationalist groups and alternative news media outlets to even get this story out there. And it wasn't until, military families actually started getting poisoned that the world even learned about Red Hill, right, and what's going on there. But it's been a problem ever since it was constructed in World War II. Yeah, so about 80 years ago, a group of people decided that it would be a good idea to store nearly 250 million gallons of toxic jet fuel and marine diesel in Kapūkaki, which is also known in English as Red Hill, which is, like you said, just 100 feet above our sole source aquifer, which provides water to basically everywhere from Mauna Loa to Hawaii Kai, so about 500,000 people. But that aquifer is connected to all other water sources, right? Like if you lose access to that water source, that affects the entire island of Oahu. And, these tanks have been leaking for decades. In fact, Civil Beat reporter Christina Jedra actually had this amazing find recently where she found an old editorial from 1978 where one of our U.S. senators basically said, we need to get millions of dollars in appropriations funding to repair these deteriorating Red Hill tanks. And that was in 1978. That's like 40 years ago. And well, I just want to caveat, I don't know if I consider myself a lead activist or organizer. There have been a lot of folks who have been working on this for years, ever since the first high-profile leak in 2014, where like 27,000 gallons of jet fuel leaked. And the only reason that didn't get international coverage was there weren't any documented cases of people ingesting that contaminated water. But ever since that leak, people in Sierra Club, Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiian organizers and community activists have been trying to get the Navy to shut down these tanks, or at the very least repair them, for 8 years at this point. And virtually nothing happened. The Sierra Club was able to get some historic wins through lawsuits, right? And that's how I kind of got plugged in. I'm an organizer, but I'm also a independent filmmaker. And so I was helping to work on some videos to bring attention to the Department of Health's contested case hearings with the Navy to assess whether or not to give them permits to continue to operate their underground storage tank facility, because these tanks have to be regulated just like any other gas station. Like your local gas station actually has better leak protection systems than the Red Hill fuel tanks, which there's 20 of them that store up to 12.5 million gallons of fuel, and they've been leaking for decades, and they're all single line. Some of them are are corroded down to the thickness of like a slipper.
Mm-hmm.
Or thong, depending on where you come from.
The Navy actually said, and I quote, "It's impossible to maintain these tanks because they're encased in degrading concrete shell."
Yes, and some samples from that concrete were taken, and I believe 19 out of 20 of them were just soaked in leaked petroleum. So that's a real testament to how long and how consistently these tanks have been leaking. I think at this point, over 200,000 gallons of fuel have leaked over time, and that's just what the Navy can catch. Another thing that is completely messed up about, sorry, can we swear?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So one thing that's completely fucked about their entire system is that even their leak detection systems are not up to par. They don't have enough leak detection systems. Their leak detection systems over time have proved over and over and over again to not be able to detect leaks in a timely or even in an accurate manner. So their own estimates of how many thousands and hundreds of thousands of gallons have leaked over time are probably a very, very low estimate of how much has actually leaked into the surrounding environment.
And what we're talking about, by the way, just so people get it, is leaked into people's drinking water.
Or into the groundwater. I mean, or into the soil, right? Yeah. Which it all goes to the groundwater, right? At some point.
Right. And also, it wasn't until the 90s that this was even declassified. So the people of Hawaii weren't aware of this basically for decades. And the Navy knew before it was declassified that it was already leaking.
Yeah, and it's really peculiar because yes, it was technically classified until the early 90s, but like I had mentioned earlier, there's an article where one of our most famous senators basically just says like, we got fuel tanks in Red Hill and they're deteriorating, and that's in like the late 70s. So it's like it was like technically classified, but I guess an open secret. And everyone in the Navy apparently knew it was a serious problem for decades. And they just didn't do anything about it. And this is just kind of a testament to the priorities of the US military and how they consider basically all life on this planet as acceptable collateral damage to the US capitalist colonial project, right? We are all acceptable externalities to the US military, specifically to the US Navy on Oahu. And that's been proven time and time and time and time again. And speaking once more to those leak detection systems, in 2014, that was the result of Tank 5, which was, in really bad shape. After they had contracted someone to repair the tank, they started refilling it. And all these literal alarms started going off. This is like a fucking Simpsons, this is like a Homer Simpson at the nuclear power plant situation where there were literal alarms going off. And they were like, we just repaired this tank. It cannot possibly be leaking. Mm-hmm. And so they kept filling it and kept filling it for days until finally someone was like, maybe we better actually check if this tank is leaking. And it was. And it turns out like 27,000 gallons of toxic jet fuel was leaking.
And that tank actually had holes in it. It wasn't just leaking, it had holes in it.
Yes, and I think they all have holes in it. In fact, they can't even fill many of these tanks to the top because they're so corroded around the top that if they actually filled some of these tanks to capacity, they would leak from the top. That's how, in the contested case hearing ruling, the case hearings officer, David Day, concluded that these tanks present an imminent threat to humans and animal and environment and the environment. And he even went so far as to call it a metaphorical ticking time bomb. And thank God that, actually, I'll let you tee this off, but the recent kind of announcement on last Monday, just 1 week ago.
Fortunately, the Navy, after a lot of pressure and a lot of activism on the ground, has said they're going to shut this down. I don't know. In my experience, dealing with the government, which the Navy, the government, sometimes they say they're going to shut things down and then they kind of just paused it until everybody stopped paying attention. But for now, it's a victory. The shut down Red Hill movement for now has succeeded. So tell me about that, all the obstacles that led to that. Because again, in Hawaii, there's been attention and media coverage, not so much nationally. But what led to the Navy? Because what really sprung this into crisis mode was more leaking that the Navy just could not minimize.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, yes, I strongly agree that if it's one thing people in Hawaii know, particularly in the indigenous people of this land, and people all over the world know, is that you do not take the U.S. military at their word. This is just the beginning of a new stage in a long and protracted struggle to make sure that the Navy actually shuts down Red Hill, defuels every single one of those tanks, and decommissions them permanently for good. And then we have to make sure that either the US military or the federal government pays for remediation to clean up the aquifer as best they can, even though I don't think anyone has any clear idea of how to do that. But they need to spend as much money as they spend on the US military. In fact, they should be taking money from the US military in order to do that. That will be the one pay-go policy that I would strenuously support, is taking money out of military projects to fund the remediation of all of the environmental and human destruction that the US military has caused, which would essentially defund the US military, which is what we need to do long term. But anyway, so
also, there's no way to know how many people have gotten sick from this. How many people?
Absolutely.
How many people's drinking water has been affected? How many people, whether it be cancer or other things that they maybe got at an early age, they didn't have family history for. This is the same thing in Flint. They didn't go around testing everybody in Flint for those things, and they certainly haven't given them Medicare for all. So in addition to a cleanup, there's no way to know how far gone this is. There's really no way to know how many people have become sick.
Yeah. And so speaking to that, another thing that we are now demanding, we have a new list of demands ever since the Secretary of Defense came out and announced that they plan to shut down Red Hill. First of all, a year is too long. They're giving themselves even more than a year because they're going to start that clock probably around late May, and that's way too late. There are, hundreds of children in mostly elementary schools in affected areas who still don't have access to clean water in their schools. They're coming to schools with brain fog, exhaustion, a whole host of long-term symptoms. And there are thousands of families who have a whole host of long-term health effects that they, like you mentioned, they won't even know the long-term consequences until they start presenting themselves in physical symptoms. And that's another demand of ours, is that the US military needs to pay not just retroactively for their healthcare, but for their healthcare in perpetuity. And for any economic constraints that have been put on them and on the fake state of Hawaii for what they've done to us, right? They have potentially incurred billions of dollars just in the near term, the next couple of years and the past year, of damages, not just for the thousands of people who were directly poisoned by the US Navy's contamination, but this entire island. We are facing not water shortages. We're going to face water outages in the summer. We may have to conserve water on the individual basis for a decade or more because of the water that we no longer have access to, because the Board of Water Supply, which has been the only government agency to actually be proactive about this problem, has shut off access to key shafts and has shut off access to some key shafts within our municipal water system, just to try to prevent cross-contamination from the Navy's wells into the municipal wells. And there are already some anecdotal reports from several places on the island where people are seeing water that does not look or smell right, where people are getting certain symptoms that are consistent with petroleum contamination. Now, it could be a variety of other things. Our infrastructure, just like any other place in the imperial core, is crumbling, right? So that's kind of the incredibly dark situation where we're in, where we have to hope that other evidences of possible contamination are the result of some other institutional failure, rusting pipes, previous contamination from monocultures, from agriculture, pesticide contamination. That's what we're hoping for, right? That this problem hasn't migrated, that this fuel plume hasn't migrated into the broad civilian population, which could happen at any moment. And because of the contamination, like Ernie Lau, who has just been what some would probably consider like the patron saint of sounding the alarm on this problem, part of Board of Water Supply, has recently warned that we are dipping into what is called the zone of mixture, and already detecting kind of alarming levels of chloride in our water. And what that means is the salinity in the fresh water is starting to get high, and they're worried that we're reaching the point where our municipal pumps are pulling from water that's too close to where fresh water mixes with salt water. And if we tap that zone of mixture, that lens, then our water may be too salty to drink. And that's what we're going to be facing in the summer. And that's all because of the US military. And so, I also should mention what happened last year that got us kind of, activated. So the Oahu Water Protectors was actually an idea that first formed from members of Sierra Club, Hawaii Peace and Justice, and a lot of other community organizers who were basically brought together by Hawaii Peace and Justice and Sierra Club to do something about this. And a lot of peace activists and environmental organizers came together in October to make sure that the Department of Health didn't just sign another blank check or didn't just let the Navy go without a fight to approve their permits to continue to operate these underground storage tanks at Red Hill. So we were already organizing and building a movement around this when in late November, there were 911 calls of people near the Red Hill facility reporting fuel smells in the air. And then around Thanksgiving, hundreds of people started reporting to the ER and on Facebook, on message boards, and making 911 calls, saying that their water was poisoned and that their home smelled like a gas station, and that they were reporting symptoms of vomiting, diarrhea, lethargy, rashes, that their babies were getting sick, violently ill, pets were dying, children were crying all hours of the night because they felt like their bodies were on fire. One person who I just recently got to talk to for the first time in a long time, because she came to one of our mutual aid community picnics. She looks so good. But when I first interviewed her, she was telling me about her daughter and how, she woke up in the middle, she couldn't sleep. And all she could do was give her like Benadryl, because she thought it was an allergic reaction to something. But she said that her daughter told her that, I think like a 7-year-old daughter told her that it felt like her entire body was covered in mosquito bites, and her throat was on fire and swollen.
The Navy moved us here, and this is not safe. Sorry.
Today marks 2 months since a petroleum leak contaminated the Pearl Harbor water system, and schools connected to those pipes still cannot use their running water.
My kids who took baths in the water, they had full body rashes. My 3-year-old had a bloody nose. My 5-year-old, she was so itchy. She told me that her body felt like she had 1,000 mosquito bites on it. They were up all night crying. It's very upsetting to me that we have to live like this.
These 7 Oahu schools have been without usable water for nearly 2 months. School staff have been hauling bottles into classrooms, setting up sanitation stations so students can wash their hands. All the disruption has even the youngest Keiki asking questions.
They asked me, why did they put the tanks by the water? Didn't they know it was poison? Who is going to save the water? And how can we save the water?
And, all of these mothers, all they could think to do was, my kid is sick. And so what do you do besides try to medicate them? You hydrate them. You give them water. You give them more water. And so what the Navy has done to these families, to us, to everyone who lives on Oahu, it's a war crime and nothing less. What they've done to the water. If any other country had done this, the people that the US military claims to be protecting us from, we wouldn't be talking about whether or not the US military gets to continue to use our water system or continue to operate those tanks, or how long it would take for them to acceptably and safely remove the fuel from those tanks. We would be talking about what kind of war crimes to charge them with at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And unfortunately,
Can you
the US.
Can you imagine if it was Russia right now? If this happened in Russia?
Or China or DPRK. Yeah. So all of these countries, they've never done anything like this to Hawaii, or anyone for that matter. And it's funny when we talk about, war crimes, because a lot of people don't know that the United States has this thing that they passed called the Hague Invasion Act, where if any of our people get charged with war crimes in the Netherlands, they have basically given themselves carte blanche to invade the Netherlands to prevent, a U.S. official or active duty service member from being charged with war crimes. So that's how unaccountable the U.S. military is to the rest of the world, including the illegally occupied sovereign nation of Hawaii.
Right. And, there's also another gaping fact here, and it's not just Hawaii, but other parts of America. Bottom line, the U.S. military, the U.S. Navy, basically, for all intents and purpose, is the government of these areas. So the Department of Health in Hawaii, it's not like they didn't have any inkling about this for decades. And when this has come out, the Department of Health in Hawaii basically put the Navy on a performance enhancement plan and gave them till like 2037 to remediate this massive God knows how many gallons of jet fuel have leaked. So that has something to do with the fact that, the Pearl Harbor, big tourist attraction. So the Navy basically, I don't want to say occupies, but the Navy basically is the ruler of this area, and the government and government officials are very submissive to the Navy. And that goes in other areas with big U.S. military bases, or where defense, weapons manufacturers or defense contractors or military bases that are big for certain local economies in the United States. There's a real conflict of interest here.
Yes. Actually, occupy is the perfect operative term here, because the U.S. military and the United States is illegally occupying the sovereign nation of Hawaii that never ceded this nation to the United States. This goes back to 1893, when the U.S. military staged a coup de main against the Kingdom of Hawaii and against Queen Liliuokalani. And the USS Boston, a Navy vessel, a weapon of war, came to the shores of Oahu and pointed cannons directly at the shoreline. And Navy service people and Marines came out of the USS Boston to make sure that all of these capitalist, white supremacist sugar plantation owners and, titans of industry were able to basically just take Hawaii from Hawaiians. And not a lot of people know about just how violent and ongoing this occupation has been for Kanaka Maoli. I myself am a Asian settler, fourth and fifth generation Asian settler to these islands. And the Asian American community here has also been complicit in the displacement of Kanaka Maoli on their land. I myself benefit tremendously in terms of class privilege from the real estate development industry here, which is one of the pillars of the economy. And the military not only takes up a huge chunk of the economy, but occupies over 20% of the land here, either through, military residences or through military installations that are scattered all across the Hawaiian Islands and doing all kinds of centuries-long environmental damage to the Aina and to the Hawaii and to the people here, to the land and water. There's instances of white phosphorus, depleted uranium, fuel, and other contaminants leaking into the soil and groundwater. Pearl Harbor is a perfect example of this. I'm glad you mentioned the Pearl Harbor Memorial, because Pu'uloa, or Pearl Harbor, used to be the breadbasket of the entire island. And now, after the US Navy got full rights to use it as a port, it is a cluster of Superfund sites. In fact, when the EPA came here to evaluate the conditions in Pearl Harbor, there were so many contaminated sites from all the heavy industry and all of the naval operations that were going on there that they had to narrow down what were dozens of potential candidates for Superfund site designation to 6 sites, the Superfund 6, which are delineated by types of contamination. That's how bad things are. That's what the US Navy does everywhere. Even in the places where they're not trying to actively kill the people that they're occupying, just to use these peoples, these colonized peoples, and their lands and their waters as lily pads for US empire. And they can't help but poison them because, first of all, they suck at doing anything other than killing people. They can't maintain living situations. They can't take care of land and water. Everything that the US military does, it runs in direct, perpendicular flow to the flow of life, to the flow of water, and to sustainable practices that indigenous people have been practicing for thousands of years. And that is why, in large part, we have come to this climate crisis. And if we don't stop the US military from engaging in this ongoing destruction, like what we see at Red Hill, even if every single other country on the planet, including the United States, goes to net zero in terms of their own non-military economy, and the US military continues to exist, we will still not hit our climate goal projections in time to avoid climate collapse. That is how much the US military is poisoning our planet.
And by the way, you mentioned the EPA, which a lot of people wrongly think just became bad under Trump. But the EPA was pretty much in on this cover up too, because the EPA, the Department of Health, and the Navy for this performance plan had it wrapped up in non-disclosure agreements, so the public wouldn't even know what the hell was in that performance plan. So the EPA has known about this. They haven't exactly been strong in terms of cleaning this up.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to say that the EPA was part of the cover-up just because The EPA, well, I mean, basically any government agency compared to the US military has almost no power. Because the US military can basically, against any regulatory agency, just be like, fuck you, what are you going to do? Shoot us? Because the US military, they have, just trillions of dollars and all of the power in the world. They are the most powerful, most oppressive institution in world history, right? So there is no regulatory agency that can tell them to do something that they don't want to do.
Right.
And it's only, the commander-in-chief or the Secretary of Defense who can draw that line. But it took concerted organizing and community pressure to get us to this point, right? To get through all of the gaslighting, all of the foot dragging, slow rolling, all of the cover-ups, all of the propaganda, and all of the institutional failure, and all of the institutional malice, to get the Secretary of Defense, to extract a major historic concession from the US military. Yeah, so, even though there are miles to go before we sleep, and I've also been instructed by many of my friends and co-organizers to get some sleep,
Mhm.
this week was a big victory, or this last week, it was a huge victory. And it is the result of years, but also most recently, months of concerted organizing, agitating, mobilizing, and unrelenting pressure from regular people, not politicians, not
Mhm.
the people in power, not bureaucrats. It was us. It was the people. It was people power, not the people in power, that made this happen.
And lastly, since we both agree you can't just trust the U.S. Navy when they say they're shutting it down, what are the next steps in terms of activists, organizers, ensuring that this is shut down and fighting for justice?
Yeah, so I've been telling people that we just finished A New Hope. And another friend just told me yesterday, to add on to that kind of metaphor, the empire always strikes back. And we got a whole bunch of shitty sequels to look forward to as well. So this is not over by any stretch of the imagination. It's just beginning. And we need to keep putting that pressure on. People who live on the continent in, the other part of illegally occupied United States, we need your continued solidarity and support. The international community has also been great on this, especially, the international socialist left has been amazing getting this word out, connecting it with the wages of US empire all around the world, from Wuhan to Palestine, to the Philippines, to Korea, to China and Russia. This is all connected, inextricably connected. And shutting down Red Hill and making sure that it's shut down and returning the land to the people of this land, the Native Hawaiians, the Kanaka Maoli, who are literal descendants of this land, that's important not just because we should be supporting that no matter what. What happens in Hawaii will reverberate out to the rest of the colonized world, to the rest of the places where the US military has, for over a century, been violating, bombing, terrorizing, massacring, pillaging, cooing, raping, and displacing people in the third world ever since they came to power, particularly after colonizing the full West into what they call Indo-Pacific region, to create a capitalist, unipolar, hegemonic world system that is in incredible state of crisis. It is teetering on collapse. And good. For the sake of all future life on this planet, for the sake of all our collective liberation, the U.S. military has to end. It has to stop what it's been doing to all of us. It's been killing and poisoning people all over the world ever since it came to prominence. And for all future generations, that needs to end. Red Hill is one of those places where we can start. And in order to do that, we need to keep organizing online for sure. Cyberbullying, so-called progressive, what I like to call faux-aggressive legislators has helped, especially the ones who live online, who have an entire brand to uphold, but bird dogging them in person whenever you can as well. Google that term if you don't know what it is, but also organizing community. We've been organizing in communities for months. And now that the COVID numbers are lifting, pending, Omicron 2 reaching community spread here, we will be knocking on doors eventually, letting people know that this is an ongoing crisis, that we need to organize our communities to demand not just reparative measures, but defensive measures and aggressive measures to hold the military, the most unaccountable institution in world history, accountable to their crimes against us. And to not even rely on them to repair the situation, because the ones who caused the problem shouldn't be in charge of repairing it.
Right.
They should only be able to fork over the money and be on the hook for any future restitution. And lastly, we need to be continuing to build bridges of solidarity and understanding and communication with the most affected families, which are the people who were poisoned by the US Navy, many of them military families. And just yesterday, we had a beautiful community picnic and talk story at a park that overlooks Pearl Harbor. We were able to kind of open up that space with some Kanaka water protectors telling mo'olelo or stories and history of that place. And it was beautiful. It was grounding, and nothing grounds you like the ground, right? On Twitter, we always joke about touching grass, but there's something to be said about being in community space out in the land and the water that we are, right? Land and water, wherever you come from, you are descended from that land and water. It is your relation. Indigenous people understand all over the world that there is no self, right? That we are all intimately connected to one another, but also inextricably connected from the land and water. And so anyway, I'm also a member of the Shutdown Red Hill Mutual Aid Collective. And so we organized this event with affected family members to invite affected family members, but to also invite just generally the community that's outside of those gated homes where the US military wants to keep their people cloistered, alienated, away from the surrounding community. And so we're opening up our space to affected community members to be able to grieve together, but also to be able to engage in joyful, company, to break bread, to share fellowship, to just exist outside of their contaminated homes. But also, as I was leaving, the families were still circled up and talking about next steps and what they were going to do next to make sure that they kept their community safe, but also to make sure that this never happens to anyone else ever again. And it was a beautiful thing to see Kanaka and other concerned community advocates just sitting in a circle in a park with affected community members talking about what's next. Because eventually what's next It's going to be a hard, long road, but it all leads to liberation. And not just for some of us, but for all of us.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, most of my journalistic career, I've covered water contamination stories and water poisoning because A, the mainstream media doesn't seem to care, but B, it's always about way more than just the water. It's about corruption, greed, lack of humanitarian care, and in this case, I agree with you. War.
And capitalism.
And capitalism. When you knowingly are allowing people to drink water that you either know is contaminated or might be contaminated, you're committing war on those people. So I'm glad that we could cover this. We'll stay on the story because I don't trust the U.S. Navy on much of anything. But as of now, credit to all the activists, community members, and residents there who have fought for this to shut down Red Hill. For now, the U.S. Navy has agreed to shut down Red Hill. Michael Inoue, an organizer, a filmmaker, thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Can I just quickly plug some organizations that have been
Sure.
doing a lot of the on-the-ground work? So definitely Oahu Water Protectors. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Shutdown Red Hill Mutual Aid Collective, all the same platforms. Kaohewai, that's KAOHEWAI. Hawaii Peace and Justice, the Sierra Club chapter of Hawaii, and Kalahui Hawaii, and there's plenty more, but those are some of the main ones. Oh, Hawaii Peace and Justice. Did I mention that? Hawaii Peace and Justice as well have been doing a lot of amazing work over the years to make sure that our land and water is protected from the U.S. illegal occupier.
Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in to Status Coup's daily live stream Monday through Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time and Fridays at 4 o'clock Eastern Time.